Hello and welcome to my first video. Today we're going to be looking at the Nikon F80 or N80 as it was called in some places. This is a Nikon film camera, and I'd just like to start this video talking about the philosophy as to why someone would want to try shooting film in a world that's digital everything pretty much. And I sort of liken the argument as to people going back to vinyl in the music industry, and why it's becoming bigger and bigger today. There's sort of a quality and warmth associated with vinyl and film that you can't reproduce on digital as easily. I mean, cameras nowadays are essentially consumer electronics. They are updated about every year and they go obsolete in the same cycle. Film cameras, on the other hand, they are slightly different in the sense that they all pretty much work the same way. If you bought a camera that came out in the 60s or one that came out in sort of the late 90s, the way they expose the picture is essentially the same. You could put a roll of film in either and the process would literally be exactly the same. Today we may concern ourselves, about sensor types or whether you have a full-frame APS-C sensor or the megapixels or whatever, but that's not really a concern of someone shooting film. So why do I have a Nikon F80 in front of me today and not something like an F100 or an F3 or an FM2? Well, while those cameras are, there's nothing wrong with them, they're really good cameras, they are very collectible. They're built like tanks, but they're extremely expensive for that reason. This Nikon F80, I believe, is probably the bargain of the century. So I live in New Zealand, and our equivalent of eBay is called Trade Me. And I picked this up for 20 New Zealand dollars, which is roughly about 14 US dollars, which is extremely cheap for a camera like this. I was basically in the market for something that I could use my AF-S lenses on because I shoot Nikon full-frame digital, and I just wanted a camera that I could swap between shooting film and shooting digital using the same lenses, so I didn't have to carry a separate bag full of film lenses. So the F80 fits that bill, and if you're wondering what I mean by AF-S lenses, well, the older Nikon autofocus lenses used an internal motor built into the camera itself. The motor would drive this little screw here, which would in turn drive a little shaft on the lens and turn the autofocus mechanism in the lens. The newer AF-S lenses actually use a motor built into the lens itself, which is driven by current pass through the contacts at the top here. So if you look at this camera, it's pretty common. It's a common design. If you're an existing Nikon shooter and I gave this to you, you would be pretty comfortable with this camera, even if you shoot Canon for that matter. It's a pretty sort of contemporary yet modern design. The one thing of note though with the lens choices is that if you have DX lenses, you probably don't want to use them on a camera like this, because then you're going to produce a black circle around the outer edge of your pictures, because DX lenses are not designed to be used on essentially full frame 35mm. So let me just quickly mount an AF-S lens here. Here I have an 85mm 1.8G lens. Just quickly mount this for you and show you that it autofocuses just fine. So let's take a quick tour around the camera. So starting from the left, we have the film advanced selector or drive selector, as we call it in digital. So we could choose from single shot, continuous, about 3 frames per second there. Timer and multiple exposure. Next to that we have the mode dial, so you could choose from program mode, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual modes. Sort of fairly standard with digital cameras as well. We also have the ISO control here, so you could pull and push your film as desired by changing the ISO. We actually have quite a few menu items that we can change on this camera, and obviously we don't have a nice big beautiful LCD screen that we can look at drop-down menus and change settings. So what Nikon has done is that they've added what they call the custom settings menu, and this is a list of about 18 different items that sort of have a binary on and off setting. So you're going to have to look up in the manual what each of these settings or what each of these numbers represent. But you scroll through the items with the rear dial, and you use the front dial to change or to toggle whether that item's on or off. So for example, item number 4 is whether the grid display is on in the viewfinder or not. So if I turn it to 0, it's off, but if I turn it to 1, it's on. Similarly, I know that number 16 is the duration of the timer. So right now it's set to 20 seconds, but I can change that to 10, 5, or 2 seconds. And that's basically how you change all the settings on the camera that we would usually find in the menu system on a digital SLR today. Next to that, well, we have a Nikon specific hot shoe, so I assume that it will work with modern TTL flashes. Certainly modern flash, a manual flash would work. Next to that is the big, bright and beautiful LCD screen of its day, which can be sort of illuminated using that button there. I don't know if you can see the green light there. Above that we have the exposure compensation button, so by turning the wheel you can over or underexpose by 0.5 of a stop. And we also have a flash compensation button. So this camera does actually have a built-in flash. And we have the power toggle switch and the shutter button. So moving around to the left of the camera, we have the autofocus toggle switch. So we could go to complete manual. We could go to single shot autofocus or continuous autofocus. Around to the side of the camera we have the back release button, so this is how you open the back of the camera to load your film in. Pretty standard across all cameras. You just load your film in and pull it to the red line over there, and then just close the back. On the back we have the bracketing button, so if you hold this you could choose your bracketing mode. We can do either 3 frames or 2 frames, and depending how many stops you want, we could go into 0.5, 1 or 2 stops. Next to that we have the flash options menu, so we could change between slow sync flash, etc. On the other side of the viewfinder we have the AEL AFL button, useful for locking your exposure and focus. So if you're doing stuff like focus and recomposing, this is particularly useful. And around that we have the metering mode. So as you can see, this camera has, let me just focus that for you. This camera has got matrix mode, it's got center weighted and spot metering. And below that we have the selector directional buttons for the autofocus points. This camera in particular has 5 autofocus points. I believe it's the same as the F100, and you could toggle between those points using these 4 directional buttons. As well as the dial next to it controls whether all points are active, which is what it's set to now. And then if I, oops, broke a nail there, flip that switch up, this changes it to single point, so now I can actually go in and actively select those points. There's a little locking switch there so that you can't actually change the point. And just coming around to this side, we have the AF Illuminator Assist light, which will help you autofocus in dark conditions. as well as the depth of field preview button. So when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can get a sense of your depth of field by hitting this button and not actually taking the picture. That's essentially all the switches around the camera. At the bottom we have the tripod mount, standard tripod mount, and the batteries that this camera takes is either the CR123A or DL123A battery. So they're not your standard sort of AA's, AAA's. They're the short 123 versions. So just keep that in mind. These obviously aren't as readily available as AA's or AAA's, but you do find them. And yeah, that's it. That's the tour of the F80. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and like, subscribe, and hopefully I'll get back to you in another one. Cheers!